Stone Brothers production.
Hello, welcome back to the Serial Killer series. Today my brother's going to be speaking for all of this episode. I was pretty busy the past 2 weeks and only had time to edit and write for the video. This episode is about 4 serial killers in Kentucky.
Number 4. Beoria Abraham Simmons III. Robin Barnes was Simmons' first victim on May 18, 1981. Simmons picked up Barnes and her 2 male friends that were hitchhiking after walking on their way home from a party. Simmons dropped off the 2 boys near their house and offered to take Barnes to Watson Lane where her home is located. Simmons dropped off the 2 boys near their house and offered to take Barnes to Watson Lane where her home is. Instead, he drove past the home another mile and forced her out of the car at gunpoint. Simmons made her pull down her jeans and panties, raping her afterward. After Barnes was raped, she attempted to run away from him. He shot her in the back and she fell to the ground on her back. Simmons then shot her 3 more times, 2 times in the neck and 1 in the chest. 2 boys were walking to school the next day and found her bullet-ridden body. About 10 months later, 29-year-old Shannon House was abducted at gunpoint by Simmons from his car about a block away from her home. Later, Simmons took her to a local park where he made her walk back into a wooded area, forcing her to take off her pants and panties. After raping Shannon, she was pulling up her clothes, and Simmons shot her 1 time in the neck, killing her. Her body was found the next morning by workers who worked at the park. 3 months later, Simmons picked up 39-year-old Nancy Bettman close to her home in Old Louisville and took her to the same exact park where he took Shannon House. Once again, he raped Bettman like his previous victims and shot her to death. Simmons dragged her body to a small, shallow drainage ditch by a horse trail, and her body was found the next morning. Less than a month later, Simmons attempted to claim his 4th victim, picking up a 16-year-old female from a bus stop very close to Shannon House's home. This young woman heard on television about 3 females being killed. When Simmons forced her out of the car to walk to a secluded part of the park, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small knife. She immediately opens the knife, stabbing Simmons in the groin, and he grimaced in pain as she ran away. She waved down to an approaching car and they went to a local police station. The police then alerted local hospitals in the area to a man coming in complaining of being stabbed. Simmons went to one of the local hospitals and he was arrested soon after. The police took the 16-year-old to the hospital where she identified that he was the attacker. He told Detective George Barrett that he had just broken up with his girlfriend, who was a redhead, a few days before he killed his first victim, Robin Barnes. Simmons said he was angry with his rejection, stating she was a streetwalker and prostitute. He said all 3 women reminded him of his ex-girlfriend since they were the same body type, hair color, and appearance. Simmons assumed that his victims were prostitutes since they were on the streets about 2 in the morning, but ironically, none of his victims were prostitutes. Simmons added, saying he was only reducing the rate of STDs by getting rid of these women. Simmons fits into a category of a mission serial killer where he'd pick out a group of people he thought were bad, like streetwalkers or prostitutes. Simmons was sentenced to death on May 13, 1985 after being convicted for 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of rape, and 1 count of kidnapping. He has been appealing since his conviction but did a plea deal on March 2, 2010 for reducing his death sentence to life in prison without parole. With that plea deal, Simmons can never appeal his conviction ever again. Prosecutors said it was the best option because half of the witnesses and detectives are dead, which Simmons could have walked free if he continued to appeal. Kay understood the reasoning, but she said she was waiting for justice in her cousin's death and life in prison isn't what she waited for. Kay added, "I wanted to see him die of lethal injection," which was his original sentence for her cousin's death. Number 3. Julia Higby. Julia Higby was a neatly dressed and prepossessing young 23-year-old country woman of the early 19th century who is thought to be perfectly sane. She had been married to a husband who was well known and is one of the most prominent farmers in Meade County. Mrs. Higby lived on the plantation of her husband while taking care of her 5 children, the oldest being 8 years old. Something in Higby's mind ticked and she started poisoning her own children and even tried on her own husband. She started off with her youngest, who was not even a year old. Her husband, Mr. Higby, was awakened by the shrieks of their youngest, and he took her to a physician who tried all his effort to relieve its suffering. However, it was useless, and after 30 hours of illness, the youngest child died. The physician saw it dying to cerebral trouble. Mrs. Higby's next victim was another child of hers who was 2 years old and also died 30 hours after being poisoned. In this case, the symptoms were confined to the nervous system without much nausea and with no intestinal irritation. The cause of death was pronounced as cerebral spinal meningitis, which is the inflammation of the meninges of both brain and spinal cord. On November 13th, her third child died, who was 4 years old and died in similar fashion. This child was suffering from extreme thirst, vomiting, and purging, which eventually led to death. The physicians were thrown off guard, and their third child also died from cerebral spinal meningitis. Mrs. Higby's attitude had changed, which threw off her husband and physicians off guard. She had acted strangely while rarely talking to her own husband and stalking around the house with rat-like stillness. On December 8th, the day before the oldest child and last victim is taken ill, Mrs. Higby expressed herself as very anxious about the child's health. Mrs. Higby told her praying husband that no one could tell when they were going to die and that she has a presentiment that they all would be dead in the next 2 weeks. The oldest child was given several buttered biscuits by her mother, who told her not to worry about making it as she would make it for her. During the next morning, while the child was absent, Mrs. Higby called her husband and instantly began asking about her health. Her husband assured her she was not to be comforted. She told him several times she was certain the child would die as the others had. Her husband grew wary of what she stated and found that his eldest child was suffering from cramps as the other victims have been attacked. In 2 hours, she relapsed into unconsciousness and remained so until death. Her husband then told his fears about his wife to the attending physician and requested him to make a post-mortem examination. However, his wife asked him not to look further into their deaths, and the matter was dropped. She was aggrieved when she learned what was intended and threatened to kill anyone who attempted a post-mortem examination. She told her husband, "I will be dead very soon myself, and they cut me up if they choose, but no one shall cut up my children." Her grief was so real that her husband's suspicions were, for a time, alleviated. 2 days after, Mrs. Higby was found in a spasmodic condition and suffered from pains like her children who'd passed. Dr. Pusey, who was present at the time, diagnosed her case and discovered that she was suffering from the same poisonous effects which the children had suffered from. Dr. Pusey then felt after she attempted to kill her husband, and killing 4 of her own children, she was trying to take her own life. Mr. Higby forgot that 3 months earlier he had bought a box of Rough-on Rats, which was rat poisoning, but had not seen it since he had brought it home. He remembered asking his wife if she had seen it. She said that she had taken it from the dining room and put it in his toolbox, which he did not see it there. Eventually, several doctors and physicians found out the children had no ulcers in their stomach, although they had large quantities of arsenic in the tissues of every part of their bodies. Dr. Pusey, who is regarded as an expert about insanity, had a careful review of the case and examined the condition of the mother. He pronounced her as an unmistakable case of puerperal insanity, which is brought out by rigid childbreeding and continuous nursing. She had a mental condition which was aggravated by loneliness and remorse, which led her with insane jealousy of her husband and upbraided him for his faithlessness. She was finally arrested when her husband left the house in order not to be present for his wife's arrest. She was taken into a cell, which she was composed and quiet as she was with her husband in the last 6 months. When asked the names of her youngest children, she said she has forgotten them and preferred not to speak of them. Her last child survived, who was 6 years of age, and Dr. Pusey stated that in all his experience he had never come across a case so paradoxical and baffling. Number 2. Robert Karl Foley. Robert Karl Foley was born on September 13, 1956. Though there is not much of Foley's early life, he started his first murder and assault on April 18, 1977 in Harlan County, stemming from a crime committed a day before. There's not much known about the first case of the victim, and he was released on parole sometime in the 1980s because of becoming an informant for the FBI. Foley was listed on parole when he committed his next crime on October 8, 1989. During this time, Foley was living in Laurel County with his wife Marjorie and was never following the law while avoiding being caught. Foley was involved in the marijuana and the distribution of moonshine, among other things. He had several buddies he hung out with. It was said his friends were not always on the right side of the law, but it appears that aside from Foley, who had a murder charge, they all stayed under the radar. It appears he also had another local friend who was named Calvin Reynolds who would hunt out with them also, but he was not as close as the others. David Gross lived in a cabin next to property owned by his uncle, named Murphy. Murphy died in August 1989, leaving his wife with the deed, but a year after she handed over the property to John Foley, which is Robert's father. Later, Robert said in court that it was his property, but due to reasoning from creditors, they had to put the land under his father's name. In October 1989, it still belonged to Murphy's wife. On September 2, 1989, Calvin Reynolds, his girlfriend Kimberly Bowersock, and Gordon Cantor were pulled over by a police officer after they were leaving from Murphy's funeral. Calvin was arrested for DUI, and nothing is known if his girlfriend or Cantor were arrested, but they were intoxicated. Robert Foley has gotten word while Calvin was in jail that Calvin's girlfriend had planned or already told Foley's parole officer that he was selling drugs. His girlfriend Bowersock lived in Ohio, but Foley made sure that people knew he was looking for her, and if they saw her, they would let him know. Calvin was released on October 7th, and his girlfriend was trying to find several people to take her to pick him up. She finally got a hold of a friend named Jerry McMillan to take her, and a second friend named Lillian Contino, who offered to ride with them. Calvin was supposed to meet them at David Gross's cabin, but when the three of them arrived, Calvin wasn't there. They then left looking for him at Calvin's home that is right down the road, and the three found him there. Soon after, the four all returned to Gross's cabin, arriving to see his girlfriend, Phoebe Watts, his two children, and Gordon Cantor. Around that time, Gordon Cantor called Robert Foley, telling him that Kimberly was in the area and was either there or coming back to Gross's cabin. Foley had Cantor hold on to his guns because he had a felony conviction and was on parole. According to Cantor, Marjorie Foley and two other witnesses heard a phone call with Robert stating Cantor to bring his guns to his house. Marjorie Foley later stated that before Robert left that night, he told her that if he isn't home by the morning he was either dead or in jail, and to tell his parents. From what Cantor stated, the two of them arrived back to Gross's cabin around 11:30 p.m. that night. When they entered, Foley grabbed Kimberly right away by the hair. Calvin went to help his girlfriend, but Foley pulled out his gun and shot him. Right after Foley shot Cantor, he shot Kimberly, Contino, and McMillan. He then went back and shot Kimberly one more time in the back of the head. Foley's reasoning was unclear, but he did not shoot David Gross when he begged for his own life. Foley, Cantor, and Gross disposed the four bodies to a log hauling trailer while Phoebe Watts cleaned up the cabin with all the blood and matter from the victims. After, the men took McMillan's car to Lexington, approximately 2 hours from where they discarded it in a motel parking lot. Cantor stated that Foley allegedly impersonated Reynolds, called an auto place while asking them to pick up the car and they would retrieve it later. All the men then felt tired after the long day and slept for a few hours before moving the bodies once more. This time they were taken to a septic tank located on Gross's estate where they added lye and concrete on top of the bodies. Nothing was very clear if anyone was looking for the four people, but nothing was ever noted about that night. All of Foley's accomplices told the exact same story, though Gross was no longer alive during this time because in October 1990 he had been shot and killed. On August 17th, 30-year-old Lynn Vaughn and his brother, 39-year-old Rodney Vaughn, both from Somerset, Kentucky, were shot to death by Foley. Before shooting them, Foley and the Vaughn brothers sat in the kitchen table drinking beer. Foley fought Rodney Vaughn after they were getting intoxicated together while admitting he instigated a fight by punching Rodney. They calmed down for a little bit to drink again, but Rodney got Foley mad after he pointed at him to not sucker punch him again, and Foley knocked him down several times with his fists. Foley then drew his revolver and shot Rodney 6 times at close range in the chest, left arm, and back. Everyone in the house emptied after that, with only Foley, the Vaughn brothers, and Ronnie Duggar in the house. Ronnie is one of the only living witnesses other than Foley, and Ronnie said that Foley grabbed another gun from a kitchen cabinet. Foley returned to the living room with Lynn Vaughn standing next to his dying brother and shot Lynn in the back of the head. He then organized Ronnie Duggar, Bill Duggar, and Danny Bryant to help him in disposing the bodies and covering up the crime. They disposed of the brothers' bodies in a sinking creek in Laurel County, attempting to cover up the incident and cast blame on other people. The mother reported them missing a day later, and they didn't return from Foley's home, located in White Oak Road. 2 days after the crime, authorities found the bodies, indicting Foley on 2 counts of capital murder and other related offenses. Foley was charged with 4 more murders after the police found 4 more corpses in a septic tank in Laurel County. In the later half of 1993, Foley got his first death sentence for the murders of the 2 Vaughn brothers. In 1994, Foley received a second death sentence for the quadruple murder of Bowersock, Reynolds, Contino, and McMillan back in 1989. Foley has been on death row since, filing many lawsuits and appeals. Since 2010, the debate regarding Kentucky's lethal injection procedures has delayed an execution date for Foley for many years. Number 1. Donald Harvey, aka Angel of Death. Harvey was born in 1952 in Butler County, Ohio. Shortly after his birth, Harvey's parents relocated to Boonville, Kentucky, a small community on the eastern slopes of the Appalachian Mountains. From age 4 and years after, he was sexually abused by his Uncle Wayne when he went to his grandmother's house. Also, Harvey was sexually abused by another neighbor named Dan Thomas and later noted that he liked when Dan paid him money for it. Martha D. Turner, who was the principal of Harvey's elementary years, said he was always well dressed and groomed. She added, he was a happy child, very sociable, and well liked by other children. That was very different from what a fellow student who stated he was a loner and a teacher's pet. Also, students added that he rarely participated outside in the schoolyard, preferring to read books and think about his future. When Harvey was in high school, he earned A's and B's with low effort, bored with the daily routine of school, dropping out at the age of 16, getting his GED in 1968. In 1969, at the age of 17, Harvey started an occasional relationship with James Peluso, which went on and off for 15 years. In 1970, being unemployed and living in Cincinnati, Harvey decided to move to London, Kentucky, where he started working at Marymount Hospital to help care for a sick grandmother. Over time while working there, Harvey became well known and was asked to work as an orderly, spending an hour with patients assisting their needs. His job consists of assisting the medical staff with duties like changing bedpans, inserting catheters, and passing out medications. On May 30th, 1970, just 2 weeks into his employment, stroke victim 88-year-old Logan Evans made Harvey mad after Evans rubbed feces on his face. After that happened, Harvey smothered Evans' face with a sheet of blue plastic and a pillow. He listened to his heart rate with a stethoscope until he died, throwing away the plastic and cleaned him up. He had no fear of being caught at the time and notified the nurse on duty with no one in the hospital having suspicions. A day later, Harvey claimed his second victim, killing James Tyree on accident by using the sizing catheter on him. Tyree let him do it, but then yelled at him to take it out afterward. Harvey used the heel of his hand to control him until he vomited blood and died soon after. On June 22, 1970, his third victim, being Elizabeth Wyatt, was considered his first mercy kill and was aware that she was praying to die. Wyatt told him she wished she could die, so he extremely lowered her oxygen supply to kill her, and she died 4 hours later after a nurse found her dead. He continued to kill 12 more patients at that hospital until March 14, 1971, killing his 15th and final victim at the hospital named Milton Sasser. Harvey killed Sasser by giving him an overdose of morphine that he had stolen from the cabinet at the nurse's station. Harvey made the mistake of trying to dispose of the needle in a toilet by clogging it up, and the maintenance man discovered the needle. Fortunately for Harvey, no one recognized a connection between the needle and Sasser's death. Harvey killed many of his victims there, often smothering them to death, hooking up faulty oxygen tanks, or giving them an overdose of medicine. The most brutal murder there included impaling a patient with a wire hanger inserted into a catheter. Harvey spent most of his time away from work, depressed and thinking of suicide. Harvey's second relationship was with Vernon Midden in 1970, who was married with children and worked as an undertaker. In many of their conversations together, Midden would sometimes talk about how the body reacts to different trauma. The information Harvey learned from that was very helpful to him as he plotted new ways to kill and avoid being caught. In 1970, he was first introduced to the occult from Midden, but wasn't allowed to take part in any rituals because he wasn't a member. His relationship became sour with Midden in January 1971, becoming depressed and fantasized about embalming Vernon alive. His last day working at Marymount Hospital was on March 31st, 1971, when he was arrested. That evening, he was arrested for burglary, and Harvey was very drunk, confessing that he was a murderer. Harvey had his first heterosexual encounter with Ruth Hodges after leaving his job at the hospital. Hodges was the daughter of a family he was staying with while in Frankfort, Kentucky, applying for jobs there. He was arrested a few more times, notably with his arrest sometime in the middle of 1971 for suspicion of burglary in his apartment building. The real reason for that arrest was to question Donald about the occult, and he admitted he had interests in the occult. During that interview, he admitted to killing 15 people at the Marymount Hospital, but no one believed him. Harvey decided to leave town and enlist in the U.S. Air Force on June 16, 1971. On March 9, 1972, he was discharged from the Air Force after he attempted to commit suicide twice during his military career, and the military finding out about his arrest. After returning home in Kentucky, he was fueled with depression and attempted to kill himself with medication. Harvey was taken to a hospital to get his stomach pumped and was transferred to VA hospital as an inpatient when his parents told him he was no longer welcome back home. He was released after 90 days and began working at Cardinal Hill Convalescent Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky in 1972. Harvey worked there for 5 months full-time and another 2 years part-time, not killing anyone while working there. In September 1975, he got a job as a nursing assistant at the VA hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. Harvey is believed to have killed at least 15 patients at that hospital. His methods of killing included injecting cyanide and adding rat poison or arsenic to his victims' food. In June 1977, he joined the occult through an initiation that is only accepted for heterosexual couples. Harvey hooked up with Jan as his partner, and they were initiated by switching partners with a couple who was already in the occult. During his initiation, he got a spiritual guidance from Duncan, who would assist him in figuring out who to kill, and Duncan was a doctor during his lifetime. From 1970 until the late 1970s, Harvey was in and out of several relationships without harming any of his lovers, but this all stopped in 1980 with his ex-lover Doug Hill. He tried to kill Hill by putting arsenic in Doug's ice cream after an argument, but he survived. In August 1980, Karl Howler was his second victim for one of his many relationships, feeding him small doses of arsenic to make him sick. He started feeding Karl lesser amounts of arsenic on Sundays to make him sick the next day because he'd go out on Mondays to cheat on him with other men. On April 1983, Harvey killed Helen Metziger because he thought she was a threat to Karl and him. He did this by putting arsenic on the leftovers he gave to her and put some arsenic in the jar of mayonnaise as well. Several weeks later, he gave her more in a pie and she developed paralysis that developed even worse problems. Helen had a tracheotomy, but she started hemorrhaging and died soon after due to Guillain-Barré syndrome. On May 1, 1983, Harvey killed Karl's father, Henry Howler, by giving him arsenic. Henry soon died 4 days later due to a stroke and a kidney failure. From 1984 to 1985, Harvey was responsible for the deaths of at least 4 people outside of the hospital. By July 1985, he was fired from the VA hospital because they found a gun in his gym bag, which was not allowed on their policy. Harvey got lucky with the incident from his previous job and never being documented in his employment records. He's able to land another job in February 1986, being a nurse's aide at the Cincinnati Drake Memorial Hospital. From April 1986 until March 1987, Harvey was suspected to kill 26 patients and tried to kill many more. On March 7, 1987, John Powell was his last known victim by giving him cyanide in his gastric feeding tube. He killed a total of 3 people, including Powell, on the same day. After his death, an autopsy was performed, and after 3 separate tests, it was confirmed that Powell had died from cyanide poisoning. The Cincinnati police started an investigation in March of 1987, interviewing family, friends, and hospital staff. The employees there were given the option to take a voluntary lie detector test, and Harvey was on the list to be tested but called in sick on the day he was supposed to take the test. Harvey soon became the lead suspect in Powell's murder, especially after investigators learned that co-workers called him the Angel of Death because he was always around where patients died. Also, it was noted that patient deaths had more than doubled since Harvey started working at the hospital. A search of his apartment turned up enough evidence to arrest Harvey with aggravated first-degree murder of John Powell. He pled guilty by reason of insanity and was held on a $200,000 bond. Investigators received his diary soon after, which didn't take long before the full depths of Harvey's crimes were exposed. Other hospital employees suspected Harvey of killing his patients and spoke out to news reporters after his arrest. This information was turned over to the police and the investigation was expanded. Harvey knew his only chance to avoid the death penalty was to accept a plea deal, agreeing to a full confession in exchange for a life sentence. Beginning on August 11, 1967, and throughout several days, Harvey confessed to killing over 70 people. Some experts even believe he killed over 100 people. He was charged with over 20 to 40 counts of aggravated murder, stated by numerous sources, and was given 28 life sentences. Authorities reported that Harvey was savagely beaten in his cell by another unknown inmate on March 30, 2017, and died from sustained injuries while at the hospital.
I hope you enjoyed the video, everyone. Please slam that like button, share my video, and subscribe. Also, can you turn on the bell below the video so you can get notified for the new videos? Stay tuned for new videos and I'll update my social media for what the next video will be about. Thanks again and I'll see you next time.